The massive council chamber stretched out like a small city beneath its transparent dome. Stars twinkled overhead, while representatives from 12 different species sat around the curved tables that formed concentric circles. The air buzzed with the sound of translation devices working overtime as dozens of languages mixed together in a constant hum of diplomatic conversation. Ambassador Jake Morrison adjusted his black suit jacket and looked down at the tablet in front of him. The message from Earth had arrived 3 hours ago during the morning break. He had read it 17 times since then, hoping the words would somehow change. They never did. Claire Davidson sat beside him, her military uniform crisp and professional. She had been unusually quiet since Jake shared the news with the human delegation during their private lunch meeting. Her fingers drummed silently against the polished table surface as she stared at the alien representatives around them. "You sure about this?" she whispered without looking at him. Jake nodded once. There was no choice in the matter. Orders from the United Earth government were clear and direct. After 18 months of careful negotiations, humanity was walking away from the table. The afternoon session was about to begin. Council leader Zephyrian Kest rose from his position at the center of the chamber. His crystalline body caught the starlight from above and scattered rainbow patterns across the curved walls. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the translation system with perfect clarity. "We will now continue discussions regarding territorial boundaries in the Outer Rim systems," Kest announced. "The human delegation has prepared updated proposals for review." Jake stood up slowly. The movement caught the attention of nearby delegates, and conversations began to fade as representatives noticed something different in his posture. Claire and the other human staff members began quietly gathering their materials. "Council Leader Kest," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I have an important announcement to make." The crystalline being tilted his head slightly, a gesture that showed curiosity among his species. "Of course, Ambassador Morrison. Please proceed." Jake looked around the chamber at faces that had become familiar over the past year and a half. There was Trade Minister Vorth from the Aquatic Cetian delegation, his blue-green skin glistening under the artificial lights. Queen Zacht represented the insectoid hives, her compound eyes reflecting dozens of tiny images of the chamber. The bear-like delegate from Ursa Major leaned forward with interest. "I have been instructed by the United Earth government to formally withdraw humanity from all ongoing negotiations with this council, effective immediately." The silence that followed was complete. Even the translation devices seemed to pause in confusion. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden quiet. Trade Minister Vorth was the first to react. He half rose from his seat, water droplets falling from his gills as he moved too quickly. "I am sorry, Ambassador. Could you repeat that statement?" "Humanity is withdrawing from all negotiations with the Galactic Council. We will be leaving the station within the next 6 hours." Council Leader Kest's crystalline structure began to flicker with patterns that Jake had learned meant extreme confusion or stress. "There must be some misunderstanding. Perhaps there has been an error in translation?" Jake shook his head. "No error. No misunderstanding. These are direct orders from my government." Queen Zacht's voice came through the speakers with a sharp, clicking quality that made several delegates flinch. "This is unprecedented. No species has ever withdrawn from council negotiations." "There is a first time for everything," Claire said quietly, but her words carried through the chamber's acoustics. The delegate from Tau Ceti, a feline humanoid with golden fur, stood up with graceful movements. "But we were making such progress. The mineral rights agreements were nearly finalized. The shipping lane protocols were almost complete." Jake began packing his own materials into a leather briefcase. "I understand this may be inconvenient for some parties. However, the decision has been made." "Inconvenient?" The bear-like delegate from Ursa Major roared, causing several smaller species to shrink back in their seats. "We have invested 18 months in these discussions, resources, time, personnel, and we appreciate everyone's efforts," Jake replied calmly. "But humanity will not be continuing with these negotiations." Council Leader Kest moved closer to the human section, his crystalline feet creating soft chiming sounds against the floor. Ambassador Morrison, surely we can discuss whatever concerns have arisen. If there are issues with the proposed agreements, we can address them. Jake closed his briefcase with a soft click. There are no concerns with the agreements themselves. This decision is not based on dissatisfaction with the negotiation process. Then why? Asked the delegate from the Rigel system, a tall, thin being with silver skin that seemed to shift and move like liquid metal. Because my government has decided that these negotiations are no longer necessary. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jake could see the confusion spreading across alien faces, each species showing bewilderment in their own unique way. Some delegates began talking rapidly among themselves in their native languages, creating a growing buzz of concerned conversation. Trade Minister Vorth approached the human table directly. Ambassador, if this is about the tariff structures, we have already agreed to significant modifications. The Council has shown remarkable flexibility on human concerns. Claire stood up and shouldered her bag. Minister Vorth, this is not about tariffs or trade terms. This is about the fact that we do not need these negotiations. Everyone needs trade relationships, Queen Zox clicked urgently. Isolation benefits no one in the modern galaxy. Jake looked around the chamber one final time. We are not isolating ourselves. We are simply choosing not to participate in this particular framework. What framework will you participate in? Council Leader Kest asked, his voice carrying a note of desperation that the translation system somehow captured perfectly. That remains to be determined, Jake said as he began walking toward the exit. The other human representatives fell in step behind him, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The remaining delegates watched in stunned silence as the human delegation filed out of the chamber. Jake paused at the doorway and turned back. One last time, we thank the Council for their hospitality and wish all member species prosperity in their future endeavors. The door sealed behind them with a soft hiss, leaving the chamber in chaos. Through the transparent walls, Jake could see delegates gesturing wildly and talking in animated groups. Council Leader Kest stood alone in the center of the room, his crystalline body flickering with rapid pattern changes that suggested complete shock. As they walked through the station corridors toward the docking bay, Claire finally spoke. Think they understand what just happened? Jake considered the question as they passed groups of alien civilians who stared at them with obvious curiosity. I do not think they have any idea what just happened, but they will figure it out soon. Enough, their ship was waiting at docking port 7. As they boarded, Jake took one last look at the massive council station through the viewport. In a few hours, they would be in hyperspace heading back to Earth. Behind them, 12 alien species would be left to contemplate something that had never happened before in galactic history. Humanity had simply walked away. Ryan Cooper sat in the neutral zone cafe sipping his coffee and reading reports on his tablet when the first wave of panic began to hit the station. It had been 48 hours since Ambassador Morrison and the main human delegation had departed for Earth, leaving only a skeleton crew to handle administrative matters and arrange the final closure of their diplomatic offices. The cafe overlooked one of the station's main viewing ports, and Ryan could see the usual traffic of merchant vessels moving through the nearby space lanes. Everything looked normal from his comfortable chair near the window, but the conversations around him told a different story. Alien voices were getting louder and more agitated by the hour. Sir, excuse me, sir, came a wet, bubbling voice from behind him. Ryan turned to see Trade Minister Vorth approaching his table, accompanied by Queen Zox from the insectoid delegation. Both aliens looked distinctly uncomfortable, which was unusual given their normally composed diplomatic demeanor. Minister Vorth, Ryan said politely, gesturing to the empty chairs at his table. Queen Zox, please, sit down. The aquatic minister settled into his specially designed chair while the insectoid queen perched on the edge of hers, her compound eyes darting nervously around the cafe. Several other patrons were watching their conversation with obvious interest. Mr. Cooper, Vorth began, his gills fluttering with agitation. "We need to understand what has happened. The situation is becoming quite serious." Ryan looked genuinely puzzled as he set down his tablet. "What situation?" Queen's eighth's mandibles clicked rapidly. A sound that Ryan had learned indicated extreme stress among her species. "The shipping lanes, human. 3 of our major commercial routes pass through systems that your government controls." "And?" Ryan prompted, though he was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "Our merchant vessels are being turned away at your border checkpoints," Vorth explained, leaning forward in his chair. "They are being told that passage through human space is no longer permitted." Ryan nodded slowly. "That makes sense. When we are not actively negotiating with the Council, there is no legal framework for allowing non-human vessels through our territory." The 2 aliens exchanged glances that managed to convey alarm even across species barriers. Vorth's skin color had shifted to a deeper blue, which Ryan knew indicated distress among his people. "But surely there must be emergency protocols," the trade minister said desperately. "Temporary arrangements while new agreements are established." Ryan took another sip of his coffee and shrugged. "I am afraid that would require negotiations. And as you know, we are not currently negotiating with anyone." Queen's eighth's entire body seemed to vibrate with agitation. "Mr. Cooper, you do not seem to understand the scope of what you are describing. The Aldebaran Shipping Consortium alone has 47 vessels backed up at your borders. The delays are costing millions of credits per day." "I am sorry to hear that," Ryan said with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Perhaps they should consider alternative routes." "Alternative routes?" Vorth's voice rose to a higher pitch, causing several nearby conversations to pause. "The detour around human space would add 3 weeks to each journey. It would make most trade routes economically unviable." Ryan pulled up a star chart on his tablet and studied it thoughtfully. 3 weeks does seem like a significant delay, but I am sure the shipping companies will adapt." The cafe had grown noticeably quieter as more patrons began listening to their conversation. Ryan noticed several other alien delegates had entered and were approaching their table with urgent expressions. The bear-like delegate from Ursa Major arrived first, his massive frame looming over their small table. "Cooper, we need to talk. The food shipments from the agricultural worlds are not getting through." Behind him came the feline delegate from Tau Ceti, her golden fur standing on end in a way that suggested extreme agitation. "The medical supply routes are completely disrupted. Our Alta colonies are reporting shortages of critical medications." Ryan looked around at the growing crowd of concerned aliens. "It sounds like you all have some significant logistical challenges to work through." "Challenges?" The Ursa Major delegate slammed a massive paw on the table, making the coffee cups jump. "This is a crisis. Your species controls the most efficient transit corridors in this entire sector." "We control the space we control," Ryan said calmly, "just as each of your species controls your own territory." The silver-skinned delegate from Rigel had joined the group, his liquid metal appearance shimmering with rapid color changes. "But the difference is that we have always allowed passage through our space under established protocols." "Protocols established through negotiations with the Council," Ryan pointed out. "Negotiations that we are no longer participating in." Queen's eighth's clicking became more rapid and higher pitched. "But you must realize that your withdrawal affects more than just formal diplomatic relationships. The entire economic infrastructure of this region depends on free passage through human space." Ryan studied the star chart on his tablet again, zooming out to show the broader galactic region. The human territories formed a rough crescent that effectively controlled access between the Council's core systems and the resource-rich outer rim worlds. For the first time since the conversation began, he looked genuinely surprised. "I had not realized our territory was quite so strategically positioned," he admitted. Trade Minister Vorth leaned across the table urgently. "Mr. Cooper, surely your government did not intend to cause this level of disruption. This affects billions of beings across dozens of star systems." "I am sure they considered all the implications of their decision," Ryan replied. Earth's leadership is quite thorough in their planning. The feline delegate from Tau Ceti spoke up, her voice carrying a note of desperation. The civilian populations in our core worlds are beginning to notice shortages. Food prices are rising as supply chains are disrupted. The industrial worlds cannot get raw materials from the outer rim, added the Rigel delegate. Manufacturing is slowing down across multiple systems. Ryan finished his coffee and stood up from the table. It sounds like you all have some difficult decisions to make about how to restructure your economic relationships. Restructure? Vorth practically gasped, water droplets flying from his gills. Mr. Cooper, we are talking about the potential collapse of interstellar commerce as we know it. That seems unlikely, Ryan said as he gathered his tablet and prepared to leave. Commerce always finds a way. Markets adapt to new realities. The bear-like delegate blocked his path. What new realities? What does your government want? There must be terms under which normal relations can be restored. Ryan looked around at the circle of increasingly desperate alien faces. I think you misunderstand the situation. My government does not want anything from the Council. That is precisely why we withdrew from negotiations. But you must want something, Queen Zoct H insisted. Every species has needs, desires, goals. Of course we do, Ryan agreed. We want to manage our own affairs without outside interference. We want to trade with whoever we choose on terms we find acceptable. We want to control our own territory and decide who can pass through it. The implications of his words seemed to hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. Vorth sank back into his chair, his skin shifting to a pale, sickly color. The Ursa Major delegate stepped aside, his massive shoulders sagging with what looked like defeat. You are saying that humanity no longer recognizes the Council's authority over interstellar relations in this region, the Rigel delegate said slowly. Ryan smiled pleasantly as he walked away from the table. I'm saying that humanity never needed the Council's permission to exist. We were simply being polite by participating in your regulatory framework. As he left the cafe, Ryan could hear the urgent conversations erupting behind him. The reality of humanity's position was finally beginning to dawn on the galactic community, and the panic was just getting started. The council chamber had never seen an emergency session quite like this one. Representatives from all 12 species filled the curved seating areas, but instead of the usual diplomatic calm, the air buzzed with barely controlled panic. Council. Leader Kess stood at the center of the room, his crystalline body flickering with stress patterns so rapid they created a strobing effect under the overhead lights. Kate Sullivan watched the proceedings from her office in Geneva through a secure transmission link. As Earth's newly appointed observer to galactic affairs, she had been given access to the Council's emergency broadcasts. What she saw on her screen would have been amusing if the implications were not so serious for billions of beings across dozens of star systems. The situation has deteriorated beyond all acceptable parameters, Kest announced to the assembled delegates. We are now facing the most serious crisis in Council history. The bear-like delegate from Ursa Major stood up without waiting for permission to speak. 18 major shipping companies have suspended all operations in the affected corridors. My government is receiving reports of supply shortages across 7 different star systems. The medical situation is becoming critical, added the feline delegate from Tau Ceti, her golden fur still standing on end from stress. The Zarathi Confederation is reporting shortages of medical isotopes that can only be produced in the Outer Rim laboratories. Their hospitals are rationing treatments that were routine just 1 week ago. Trade Minister Vorth rose from his specialized aquatic chair, water droplets falling to the floor as he moved. The economic impact is spreading faster than our analysts predicted. Food prices in the core worlds have increased by 40% since the humans closed their borders. Kate leaned back in her chair and pulled up a 3-dimensional map of local space on her secondary monitor. The human territories showed up as a green crescent that curved through the most valuable regions of the sector. For 50 years, alien vessels had moved freely through that space. making the arrangement so routine that everyone had forgotten it was a privilege rather than a right. How did we not realize the extent of our dependence on human-controlled space? Asked the silver-skinned delegate from Rigel, his liquid metal surface rippling with agitation. Queen Zake's compound eyes reflected the chamber lights as she responded with sharp clicking sounds. Because they never restricted access before. For 5 decades, human space has been effectively open to all council members. And now it is not, Kess said simply, his crystalline structure dimming with what Kate recognized as the Zephyrian equivalent of despair. Amy June monitored the council session from Earth's orbital command center, surrounded by holographic displays, showing real-time traffic patterns throughout human space. What she saw told a very different story than the crisis being described in the council chamber. Human merchant vessels moved freely through the closed borders, carrying goods between Earth's colonies and trading posts. Internal commerce was booming as human businesses rushed to fill the gaps left by interrupted alien trade. Commander Rodriguez, Amy called to her second-in-command, what are we seeing in terms of economic impact within human space? Rodriguez pulled up a series of charts showing trade volumes and economic indicators. Actually quite positive, ma'am. Domestic shipping is up 60% from last week. Human manufacturing companies are reporting increased orders as alien competitors are cut off from their supply chains. Amy nodded thoughtfully. The closed borders had created an unexpected economic boom for human industry. Companies that had been struggling to compete with cheaper alien imports suddenly found themselves with captive markets and growing demand. Back in the council chamber, the delegate from the Centauri system was presenting increasingly dire reports. The agricultural worlds cannot get their products to market. Entire harvests are rotting in storage facilities while populations in the industrial systems face food shortages. The mining operations in the Outer Rim are shutting down, reported the insectoid representative from the Vega colonies. They cannot get their raw materials to the processing centers in the core worlds without passage through human territory. Kest moved to the central display console and activated a large holographic map of the sector. Red lines showed the blocked shipping routes, creating a web of disrupted commerce that stretched across light years. The pattern was unmistakable. Human space formed a bottleneck that controlled access to the most valuable trade routes in the region. We estimate that over 3 billion beings are directly affected by these disruptions, Kest announced grimly. The number will continue to grow as secondary effects spread through our interconnected economies. The bear-like delegate slammed his massive paw against his console. There must be something we can offer them. Every species has needs that can be met through negotiation. What if they truly do not need anything from us? Asked the aquatic delegate from the Dolphin Nebula, her voice carrying through her water-filled speaking apparatus with a haunting quality. The question hung in the chamber like a toxic gas. For the first time since the emergency session began, complete silence fell over the assembled representatives. The translation systems hummed quietly while dozens of alien minds grappled with a possibility they had never seriously considered. Trade Minister Vorth was the first to speak. That is impossible. No species in galactic history has achieved complete self-sufficiency. The humans might be the first, Queen Zak clicked ominously. Kate Sullivan smiled slightly as she watched the realization slowly spread across alien faces on her screen. Earth's economic analysts had been studying this possibility for months before the decision to withdraw from negotiations. Human space contained vast mineral resources, agricultural worlds capable of feeding the entire human population and manufacturing facilities that could produce everything from basic consumer goods to advanced technology. The Council had always assumed that humanity needed access to alien markets and resources to maintain their standard of living. In reality, the opposite was true. The aliens needed access to human space and human resources far more than humanity needed anything from them. The passenger transport companies are also reporting major problems, announced the delegate from Alpha Centauri. Tourism between the Outer Rim pleasure worlds and the core systems has dropped to nearly zero. Entire resort planets are facing economic collapse. The scientific research stations are being evacuated, added the crystalline representative from the Diamond Worlds. They cannot maintain their operations without regular supply runs from the core laboratories. Amy Chung watched the human side of the situation unfold on her monitors with growing satisfaction. Human colonies that had previously been considered remote outposts were suddenly experiencing unprecedented prosperity as they became critical links in the new internal trade networks. Human shipping companies were expanding their fleets to meet growing demand. "Ma'am," Commander Rodriguez reported, "we are receiving requests from several alien governments for emergency humanitarian corridors through our space." "What kind of requests?" "Medical supply shipments to prevent civilian casualties. Food deliveries to prevent famine on some of the more isolated worlds." Amy considered the implications. Those would require case-by-case approval from the highest levels of government, and they would need to be genuine emergencies, not routine commercial disruptions disguised as humanitarian crises. The distinction was important. Humanitarian aid could be provided on human terms without acknowledging any obligation to restore normal commerce. It would reinforce humanity's position as the controlling power in the region rather than weakening it. In the council chamber, Kest was attempting to maintain order as representatives from different species began arguing among themselves about who was most affected by the crisis and whose needs should take priority. "We must present a united response," he pleaded, but his words were lost in the growing chaos of conflicting demands and desperate suggestions. "Kate." Sullivan closed the transmission link and turned to her aide. "Send the message to all human diplomatic posts. They should be prepared for a significant increase in direct contact from individual alien governments. I suspect the age of dealing with the Council as a unified body is about to end." The cascade effect was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control it, and humanity was positioned perfectly to benefit from the chaos. The decision to send a delegation directly to Earth was unprecedented in galactic diplomatic history. Never before had the full Council bypassed normal protocols to approach a single species on their home territory. Council Leader Kest stood in the cramped briefing room aboard the diplomatic vessel Harmony as it approached the outer edges of human space, reviewing his notes one final time. "Remember," he told his companions, "we are not here as conquerors or equals demanding recognition. We are here as concerned neighbors hoping to restore mutually beneficial relationships." Trade Minister Vorth adjusted his portable water recycling unit and nodded agreement. The aquatic being had insisted on coming despite the obvious discomfort of long-distance space travel in a ship not designed for his species. The economic projections are becoming worse each day. If this continues for another month, some of our member worlds may face genuine famine. Security Chief Nexus from the Android Collective remained silent, his metallic features showing no expression. As the newest member of the Council, his people had been less affected by the human border closure, but even they were beginning to feel the impact on their supply chains. The Harmony dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system and immediately found itself surrounded by human patrol craft. The sleek vessels moved with precision and purpose, forming an escort formation that was clearly military in nature despite its polite appearance. "Diplomatic vessel Harmony, this is Earth Defense Command," came a crisp voice over the communication system. "Please state your business in human space." Kest activated the transmission system with hands that trembled slightly. "Earth Defense Command, this is Council Leader Kest of the Galactic Council. We request permission to approach Earth for urgent diplomatic discussions." There was a long pause before the response came. "Council Leader Kest, you are cleared to proceed to Luna Gateway Station. Please follow your escort and do not deviate from the designated flight path." As they traveled deeper into the system, Kest could not help but notice the increased military activity around them. Human warships patrolled the space lanes with obvious confidence, their weapon systems powered but not aimed. It was a subtle but unmistakable display of strength. Luna Gateway Station was impressive in its efficiency. Immigration Officer Ben Harris processed their credentials with professional courtesy, but Kest noticed the thorough security scans and the discreet but obvious military personnel stationed throughout the facility. "Welcome to human space," Harris said with a polite smile. "I trust you understand that your vessel will need to remain in the designated diplomatic parking area during your visit." "Of course," Kest replied, though his stress patterns flickered, as he observed the tight security measures. This was not the relaxed, open society that had participated in council negotiations for 50 years. This was a civilization that had shifted into a more defensive posture. Commander Lisa Martinez arrived to escort them to Earth aboard the patrol vessel Guardian. During the journey, Trade Minister Vorth attempted to engage her in conversation about the situation affecting both human and alien populations. "Surely your leadership recognizes the humanitarian crisis developing across multiple star systems," he ventured, his gills fluttering with nervous energy. Lisa glanced at her navigation displays, which showed dozens of human merchant vessels moving freely through space that had been clogged with alien traffic just weeks before. "Crisis is a relative term, Minister. From where I sit, everything looks quite organized." "But the suffering of civilian populations," Vorth pressed. "Children on some worlds are going without adequate nutrition because food shipments cannot reach them." "That sounds like a logistics problem that their governments need to solve," Lisa replied without any apparent concern. "Human children are eating just fine." Security Chief Nexus spoke for the first time since boarding their ship. "Commander Martinez, does your government have any interest in maintaining peaceful relationships with other species?" "Absolutely," Lisa answered immediately. "We are very interested in peaceful relationships with anyone who approaches us respectfully and offers genuine mutual benefit." The android's optical sensors focused on her with increased intensity. "What constitutes genuine mutual benefit in your government's opinion?" "That depends entirely on what the other party brings to the table," Lisa said as Earth grew larger in the viewports ahead of them. The delegation was ultimately granted a meeting with President Alex Harrison in Washington. The human leader received them in the Oval Office, flanked by Secretary of State Emma Rodriguez and Defense Secretary Matt Collins. The setting was deliberately formal, with American flags and symbols of human achievement prominently displayed. "We appreciate you making such a long journey," President Harrison said as they settled into the arranged seating. "Though I must admit, I am not entirely certain what we have to discuss." Kest leaned forward eagerly, his crystalline structure brightening with hope. "Mr. President, the Council recognizes that our previous negotiation framework may have been insufficient to address humanity's legitimate concerns. We are prepared to offer substantial revisions to all proposed agreements." President Harrison exchanged glances with his advisors before responding. "I think there may be a fundamental misunderstanding about our position, Council Leader Kest." "What kind of misunderstanding?" Trade Minister Vorth interjected, his desperation beginning to show through his diplomatic training. Secretary Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "You seem to believe that we ended negotiations because we were dissatisfied with the terms being offered, were you not?" asked Security Chief Nexus, his mechanical voice carrying a note of confusion. "Not at all," President Harrison replied calmly. "The terms were quite reasonable from a traditional diplomatic perspective." Kest's stress patterns began flickering more rapidly. "Then why did you withdraw?" "What does humanity want that we failed to offer?" Defense Secretary Collins spoke up for the first time. "That is exactly the wrong question, Council Leader." "I do not understand," Kest admitted. "The question is not what we want from you," Collins explained. "The question is what you need from us." The silence that followed was deafening. Kest could hear his own crystalline structure humming with stress harmonics as the implications of the statement began to sink in. Trade Minister Vorth's gills had stopped moving entirely, and Security Chief Nexus had gone completely still. "You are saying that you do not need the Council's cooperation to maintain your civilization," Vorth said slowly. "That is correct," Secretary Rodriguez confirmed. We have been providing you with access to our territory, our resources, and our markets out of a desire to maintain friendly relationships, not because we needed anything in return." President Harrison stood up and moved to the window overlooking the South Lawn. "For 50 years, the Council has operated under the assumption that humanity required your permission to exist and thrive in this region of space. That assumption was incorrect." Kest felt his entire worldview shifting like a planet knocked off its orbital axis. "But surely mutual cooperation benefits everyone involved." "Absolutely," President Harrison agreed, turning back to face them. "When the cooperation is genuinely mutual and voluntary. But what we discovered is that our participation in the Council framework was neither." "How so?" Security Chief Nexus asked, his programming struggling to process this new information. "Because you assumed you had authority over us that we never granted," Defense Secretary Collins explained. "You treated human space as part of your jurisdiction rather than recognizing it as sovereign territory that we chose to share." Trade Minister Vorth slumped in his chair as the full weight of their mistake became clear. "What do you want from U.S. now?" Secretary Rodriguez smiled pleasantly but without warmth. "We want to be left alone to manage our own affairs without outside interference. If other species wish to interact with humanity, they are welcome to approach us directly with proposals for mutual benefit." "Direct approaches?" Kest asked weakly. "Not through the Council?" "The Council never had any real authority over humanity," President Harrison said matter-of-factly. "We simply allowed you to believe that it did because it seemed like a polite way to maintain regional stability." The meeting continued for another hour, but the essential message had been delivered in those first few devastating minutes. Humanity had never been under the Council's authority, and they were no longer interested in pretending otherwise. The age of Council dominance in the region was over, and a new reality was beginning to emerge. As their ship departed Earth orbit, Kest stared out at the thriving human civilization below and wondered how they had been so blind to the truth for so many years. 6 months after the Council delegation returned from Earth, the galactic political landscape had changed beyond recognition. Dr. Sophie Walker stood in her office overlooking New York Harbor, watching human cargo vessels load supplies for the outer colonies. Through her window, she could see the steady stream of ships that now moved freely through what had once been congested alien shipping lanes. As Earth's new Minister of Interspecies Affairs, Sophie had watched the old order collapse with remarkable speed. The Council had tried to maintain unity after their failed mission to Earth, but desperation had torn their alliance apart. Individual species had begun reaching out to humanity. Directly within weeks of the delegation's return, the first to break ranks had been the aquatic Cetians. Trade Minister Vorth had sent a private message to Sophie's office just 5 days after returning from Earth, requesting discreet negotiations for emergency medical supplies. Their underwater cities were facing critical shortages of synthetic oxygen that could only be produced in human facilities. "Dr. Walker," her assistant announced through the intercom, "the Tau Ceti delegation has arrived for their appointment." Sophie smiled as she turned away from the window. The feline species had been among the most cooperative in establishing new bilateral relationships with humanity. Their natural hunting instincts had served them well in recognizing which way the political winds were blowing. Ambassadors Kira Sunmain entered the office with the graceful movements characteristic of her species. Her golden fur was perfectly groomed, and her emerald eyes showed the intelligent calculation that had made the Tau Cetians successful traders throughout the galaxy. "Minister Walker," Kira said with a respectful bow, "my government wishes to express our continued gratitude for the medical corridor agreements." "I am pleased that the arrangement is working well for both parties," Sophie replied, gesturing for the ambassador to take a seat. "Your people have been very reliable partners." The medical corridor arrangement was typical of humanity's new approach to interspecies relations. The Tau Cetians received guaranteed passage through human space for their hospital ships and medical supply convoys. In return, They provided human colonies with advanced medical technology and shared research data from their biological laboratories. We have a proposal for expanding our cooperation, Kira continued, producing a data tablet from her diplomatic pouch. My government would like to discuss exclusive trading rights with human agricultural worlds. Sophie reviewed the proposal with interest. The Taotians were offering premium prices for human food products in exchange for guaranteed supply contracts that would bypass their former council partners entirely. It was exactly the kind of arrangement that benefited both species while reinforcing humanity's position as the dominant regional power. This looks very promising, Sophie said after finishing her review. We should be able to finalize something along these lines within the next few weeks. The contrast with the old council system was remarkable. Instead of months of multilateral negotiations involving 12 different species with conflicting interests, humanity now conducted efficient bilateral talks that produced results quickly. Each species approached with their own needs and their own offerings, creating a web of individual relationships that all centered on Earth. Commander Nick Torres stood on the observation deck of the UES Independence, humanity's new diplomatic flagship, and watched vessels from 6 different species dock at the neutral trade station that had been built at the former council headquarters. The irony was not lost on him that aliens now came as supplicants to the same location where they had once presumed to govern human affairs. Sir, his communications officer reported, we have received 3 new requests for diplomatic meetings. This week? Which species? Nick asked, though he was not particularly surprised by the continuing stream of requests. The Rigel Confederation, the Vegan Mining Consortium, and the Andromedan Research Collective. Nick nodded thoughtfully. The Rigel Confederation had been among the most resistant to acknowledging the new reality, but their liquid metal technology was apparently not sufficient to maintain their economy without access to human-controlled trade routes. The mining consortium was more surprising, since their asteroid operations were relatively self-contained, but even they needed human-made equipment and supplies. Schedule them for next month, Nick decided. Make sure they understand that all discussions will be conducted on a bilateral basis with no reference to council authority. The old council structure had officially dissolved 3 months earlier, when it became clear that individual members were negotiating separately with humanity despite official proclamations about maintaining unity. Queen Zax had been the last to abandon the pretense, finally approaching Earth for emergency food supplies when her insectoid colonies faced starvation. The dissolution had been remarkably peaceful, with no violence or dramatic confrontations. The council members had simply stopped showing up to meetings that no longer served any purpose. The Grand Chamber, where 12 species had once debated galactic policy, now served as a museum, a reminder of how quickly political realities could change. Dr. Walker's intercom chimed again. Minister, the Zephyrion delegation is requesting an urgent meeting regarding their crystal mining operations. Sophie was not surprised. Council leader Kess people had been among the most affected by the border closures, since their crystalline technology required rare elements that could only be found in human-controlled asteroid fields. They had held out longer than most, probably hoping that their former leadership role would give them some advantage in negotiations. Tell them I can see them next week, Sophie replied. Same terms as everyone else? The same terms had become humanity's standard approach to all interspecies relationships. Each species was welcome to propose mutually beneficial arrangements, but there would be no special consideration for former council members and no acknowledgement of any authority beyond Earth's own government. The economic results had been remarkable. For humanity, human shipping companies had expanded rapidly to fill the gaps left by disrupted alien commerce. Manufacturing centers on Earth and the colonies were operating at full capacity to meet demand from species that could no longer rely on their previous trade networks. Unemployment had dropped to historic lows as new opportunities emerged throughout. Human Space. Commander Torres received a priority message on his personal communicator and read it with growing satisfaction. The Ursa Major delegation had finally agreed to human terms for a new trade agreement. abandoning their demands for special consideration based on their former council status. Their massive industrial capacity would be valuable for human expansion plans, but only on humanity's terms. "Commander," his aide approached with a datapad, "the latest economic reports from Earth are ready for your review." Torres scanned the numbers with satisfaction. Human gross domestic product was up 40% from the previous year. Colonial development was proceeding ahead of schedule as resources previously committed to alien trade were redirected to internal growth. Population centers throughout human space were experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The transformation had been so complete that it was sometimes difficult to remember how things had been before. The old system where humanity participated in council negotiations as one species among 12 now seemed like ancient history. The new reality had humanity at the center of a web of bilateral relationships that all operated according to human preferences and priorities. Dr. Walker stood at her window again as the day ended, watching the lights of human vessels moving through the harbor. Tomorrow would bring more meetings with alien delegations, more negotiations for agreements that reinforced humanity's dominant position, and more evidence that the species that had once presumed to govern human affairs now needed humanity far more than humanity had ever needed them. The Council had panicked when humanity shut down negotiations, and they had been absolutely right to panic. The old order was gone forever, replaced by a new reality where humanity was not just another member of a galactic community, but the regional superpower that others approached with respect and careful offerings of mutual benefit. The age of human deference to alien authority had ended not with war or conquest, but with the simple recognition that humanity had never needed anyone's permission to be great.